I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a family was losing someone you love. I was wrong. The morning my billionaire grandmother died, I held her hand and promised I'd be okay. By nightfall, I was sitting in a leather chair across from her lawyer, staring at a number that made my heart stop. $15 billion. That was what she left me. Not my father. Not my stepmother. Not my half-brother. Me. My dad didn't mourn. He leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp, and said, "You'll sign it over. Tonight." I remember the way the room felt smaller when I shook my head. I won't. That single word cost me my home. Before midnight, I was standing outside with a bag in my hand, cut off from my own family. By morning, I unlocked the gates of my grandmother's mansion, thinking I was finally safe. I had no idea what would happen the next day, or who would be standing beside me when my father came to take everything. Before all of this, my life was quiet in a way most people would probably call forgettable. I'm Stella, and for as long as I can remember, I was the least important person in my father's house. Not mistreated in obvious ways, no shouting, no scenes that neighbors could gossip about, but overlooked so consistently that it left bruises no one else could see. My dad, Robert, had always been focused on control. Control of his career, control of his image, control of the people around him. Love, to him, was something you earned by being useful. I never quite managed that. I worked a normal job, paid my own bills, and kept my head down. When I came home for holidays, my stepmother Linda would smile tightly and ask questions that sounded polite but landed like judgments. "Still at the same job? Have you thought about doing something more ambitious?" My half-brother Evan didn't even pretend. He talked about money the way other people talked about weather, constantly, casually, as if it were the only thing worth noticing. Startups, investments. What he'd do when he finally got his hands on real capital. In that house, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My grandmother, Margaret, was the opposite of all of them. To the public, she was a billionaire with a sharp mind and an iron reputation. Newspapers loved to describe her as formidable and unyielding. But to me, she was the woman who brewed tea too strong, hummed old songs while walking through her garden, and insisted I sit down and eat before telling her anything important. She never asked me how much I made. She asked me if I was sleeping well, if I felt proud of myself, if I was being kind to others, and to myself. When I was younger, I used to wonder why she looked tired whenever my father visited her. He'd arrive with folders, suggestions, subtle complaints about cash flow and missed opportunities. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. He never came as a son. He came as a negotiator. After those visits, Grandma would squeeze my hand and say, "Promise me something, Stella." "What?" I'd ask. "If anyone ever tries to buy your silence or your obedience, walk away." At the time, I thought it was just advice. The kind grandparents give when they've seen the world turn people sharp at the edges. I didn't know she was preparing me. As her health began to fail, I visited more often. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. We talked about everything except money, books, regrets. The strange way families can love and still hurt each other. Sometimes she'd look at me for a long moment like she was memorizing my face. One afternoon, as I was leaving, she pressed a small key into my palm. "Just in case," she said. I laughed and told her she was being dramatic. She didn't laugh back. When she passed away, the house felt colder than it ever had. My father took charge immediately. Arrangements, schedules, decisions like grief was just another project to manage. I stood off to the side, invisible again, grieving quietly. I told myself nothing would change, that I'd attend the funeral, go back to my life, and carry her memory with me like a private ache. I couldn't have been more wrong, because my grandmother hadn't just left me memories. She had left me a decision. One that would tear my family apart and force me to find out who I really was when everything familiar was taken away. The will was read 3 days after the funeral. By then, the shock of losing my grandmother had settled into something heavy and dull, like a weight pressing on my chest every time I breathed. I walked into Daniel Moore's office expecting formality, maybe a polite division of assets, and then a quiet return to my life. I never imagined that room would become a battlefield. The conference table was long and polished, the kind that made you sit up straighter without realizing why. My father, Robert, took the seat at the head as if it belonged to him by birthright. Linda settled beside him, composed and watchful. Evan lounged back in his chair, scrolling on his phone, bored already as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion. I chose a chair near the end of the table. Daniel cleared his throat and began, his voice calm, measured. He spoke about dates, revisions, witnesses, about my grandmother being of sound mind when she finalized her will. My father waved a hand impatiently. "Just read it," he said. "We all know how this works." Daniel didn't react. He simply opened the folder and continued. When he said my name, I barely registered it at first. "To my granddaughter Stella Harris, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all financial assets, properties, investments, and holdings, valued at approximately $15 billion. For a moment, there was no sound at all. Then the room erupted. "What?" my father snapped, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped the floor. "That's not possible." Linda's hand flew to her chest. "This has to be a mistake." Evan finally looked up, his expression sharpening. "Where's my share?" I sat frozen, my pulse roaring in my ears. 15 billion. The number didn't feel real. It felt like a foreign language I didn't speak. Daniel raised a hand. "Your grandmother's instructions were explicit." My father turned to me, his eyes burning. "You did this," he said. "You got into her head." I shook my head, my voice barely steady. "I didn't even know she'd changed it. That money belongs to this family," he snapped, "and I'm the one who should control it." The word control landed hard. Daniel leaned forward. "Miss Harris, do you accept the inheritance as outlined?" Every face in the room was turned toward me, expectant, demanding. I thought of my grandmother's voice. "If anyone ever tries to buy your obedience, walk away." I lifted my chin. "Yes," I said quietly. "I accept." The silence that followed was sharp, electric. My father's expression changed then, not to grief, not to disappointment, but to something colder. "This conversation isn't over," he said. I didn't know yet how much he meant it. The real confrontation didn't happen at the lawyer's office. That was just the warning shot. It happened later that evening, behind closed doors, when there were no witnesses left to impress and no polite voices to maintain. My father told me to come home. He didn't ask. He didn't soften it with concern or grief. "Get back here," he said over the phone. "We need to talk. As a family." The word family should have comforted me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. When I arrived, the house felt different, too quiet. The lights in the living room were brighter than usual, every lamp switched on as if this were an interrogation room rather than a home. My father stood near the fireplace, his jacket still on, his posture rigid. Linda sat upright on the edge of the sofa, hands folded neatly in her lap. Evan leaned against the wall, scrolling on his phone, but his eyes flicked up the moment I entered. "Sit," my father said. I sat. He didn't waste time. "You're going to fix what you did today," he said calmly, too calmly. "You're going to sign the inheritance over to me, and we're going to pretend this embarrassing misunderstanding never happened." I swallowed. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Grandma chose— "Don't say her name like that," he snapped. "You know exactly what you did. You took advantage of her age, of her emotions." "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking despite myself. "I never asked her for anything. I didn't even know about the will." Linda leaned forward then, her tone gentle, almost maternal. "Stella, no one is saying you're a bad person. You're just not equipped for this kind of responsibility. $15 billion isn't a gift. It's a burden." Evan finally looked up, rolling his eyes. "She wouldn't last 6 months managing that kind of money." My father nodded. "Exactly. That's why I'm offering a solution." He walked to the sideboard, picked up a folder and placed it in front of me. "Sign the estate into my control," he said. "I'll give you 10%, more money than you'll ever need. You can live comfortably, travel, do whatever it is you do now. No pressure. 10%. The number hit me like a slap. "So you keep everything," I said quietly, "and I disappear?" "That's not fair," Linda said quickly. "You'll still be part of the family." Evan snorted. "As long as she behaves." I looked at the paper in front of me, at the space where my signature was supposed to go. I thought about my grandmother's hands, thin, warm, steady, about the way she looked at me when she talked about choices and consequences. I'm not signing, I said. My father's face changed instantly. The calm vanished. This isn't a request, he said, stepping closer. You think you can defy me and walk away untouched? I'm not defying you, I said. I'm honoring her. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. If you walk away from this deal, you walk away from this family. Hesitant jest. And that is the schemes of his appointmenters. The room felt smaller, hotter. You're choosing money over us, Linda said, her disappointment sharp and practiced. No, I replied, my heart pounding. You're asking me to choose control over my own life. My father straightened, as if something inside him had snapped into place. Pack your things, he said. You have 30 minutes. After that, you're out. Evan smirked, already convinced he'd won something. Linda stood and turned away, as if watching me leave would be inconvenient. I sat there for a moment longer, waiting stupidly for someone to stop him. For someone to say this had gone too far. No one did. That was when I understood something I'd avoided my entire life. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about obedience. And the moment I refused to give it, I stopped being family. I packed in silence. 30 minutes sounded generous when my father said it, but time moves differently when you realize you're being erased from your own life. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd slept in for years, the one that still smelled faintly of the detergent Linda insisted on using. The walls were lined with old photos I'd stopped looking at school events, forced smiles, moments that looked like happiness if you didn't know how carefully they were staged. My hands shook as I opened the closet. I didn't take much. Clothes, my laptop, a few personal papers. I skipped the things that suddenly felt meaningless gifts chosen by obligation, decorations that had never really been mine. At the bottom of a drawer, my fingers brushed against something solid and cold. A small brass key. For a second, I just stared at it. My grandmother had pressed it into my palm months ago, closing my fingers around it like it mattered more than I understood. Just in case, she'd said. I slipped it into my pocket, my chest tight, as if I were stealing something sacred. When I came back downstairs, my suitcase trailing behind me, my father was already waiting by the front door. His arms were crossed. His expression was final. You're making a mistake, he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't angry because he'd lost his daughter. He was angry because he'd lost control. Goodbye, Dad, I said quietly. He didn't answer. He simply opened the door and stepped aside. The night air hit me like a wall. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. I stepped onto the porch, my bag heavier than it should have been, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. Behind me, Linda's voice floated out, calm and distant. Don't expect us to fix this later. The door closed. Not gently. The sound echoed in the quiet street, sealing something I knew couldn't be undone. For a moment, I just stood there, homeless, cut off. The inheritance papers tucked safely in my bag, worth more than I could comprehend and utterly useless in that instant. I had nowhere to go. No plan, no safety net. Except for the key in my pocket, I got into my car and drove. The city lights blurred past as tears burned my eyes. I didn't know what I expected to feel: anger, panic, relief, but mostly I felt empty. When the iron gates of my grandmother's estate came into view, towering and familiar, my breath caught. I hesitated before turning the wheel. This place had always been hers. Warm, alive, full of quiet laughter and afternoon light. Now she was gone, and I was arriving not as a guest but as someone with nowhere else left. The key slid into the lock smoothly. The gates opened with a slow, heavy groan, like the house itself was waking up. I drove up the long driveway, my headlights cutting through the darkness, and parked in front of the mansion. The windows were dark. The silence pressed in. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing across marble floors. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, comforting and painful all at once. "Hello?" I called softly. For a terrifying second, there was no answer. Then a voice came from the shadows. "Miss Stella." I turned, startled, to see a tall man with silver-streaked hair stepping forward. He wore a neatly pressed suit, and an expression that shifted from surprise to something gentler. "Thomas Reed," he said. "Your grandmother's house manager." Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. "I thought I'd be alone," I admitted. Thomas shook his head slowly. Mrs. Harris was very clear, he said. If you ever came here like this, you were never to be alone. Something inside me cracked. For the first time that night, standing in the house my grandmother loved, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, being thrown out wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something my family could no longer control. I didn't sleep that night. Even though Thomas showed me to a warm guest room, the one I always stayed in when I visited, my mind refused to slow down. The bed was too big. The house was too quiet. Every creak of the old mansion made me think of my father's voice, sharp and final, telling me I no longer belonged. Morning light finally crept through the curtains, pale and hesitant. I sat up, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, when there was a soft knock on the door. Miss Stella, Thomas said gently. You have visitors. My stomach tightened. They're not my family, are they? No, he replied. Your grandmother asked for this. Downstairs, in the study, 2 people were waiting. The first was Daniel Moore, my grandmother's lawyer, the same calm man who had read the will. The second was a woman I didn't recognize, elegant but unassuming, with silver-framed glasses and a leather portfolio resting on her lap. Stella, Daniel said, standing. I'm glad you came here. The woman offered her hand. Grace Wilson. I oversee the Harris Family Trust. Trust. The word landed differently now. Daniel gestured for me to sit. Your grandmother anticipated conflict, he said without hesitation. Specifically, from your father. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She knew he would try to take it. She knew he would try to control you, Grace corrected softly. Daniel opened his briefcase and laid several folders on the desk. Documents, legal seals, dates that stretched back years. Your inheritance isn't a simple transfer of assets, he explained. It's protected by a non-transferable trust. You cannot sign it over to anyone. Not your father, not your brother, not anyone. I stared at him. So, even if I wanted to, I couldn't? Grace shook her head. Your grandmother made sure of that. Any attempt to coerce you would invalidate their claims entirely. My chest tightened. She did all this, without telling me. Daniel nodded. She believed telling you too soon would put you at risk. Then he reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a small flash drive. There's more. Thomas closed the study doors quietly as the screen on the wall flickered to life. My grandmother appeared, seated in her favorite chair, her posture straight, her expression clear and unwavering. If you're watching this, she said, then I'm gone, and Stella is likely under pressure. My breath caught. She spoke calmly, naming my father directly, not with anger but with disappointment. She talked about the years of financial demands, the subtle threats, the entitlement that had replaced affection. She explained why she chose me. Stella never asked me for anything, she said. She showed up, she listened. She treated people as people, not leverage. The video ended. I sat there in silence, tears slipping down my face before I could stop them. She didn't just leave you money, Grace said quietly. She left you protection. Daniel folded his hands. Your father has no legal ground, but that won't stop him from trying. I thought of the way he'd looked at me the night before, the certainty in his voice. What happens when he comes here? I asked. Thomas spoke for the first time, his tone firm. Then he'll find out that this house and everything tied to it is no longer something he can take. For the first time since my grandmother died, something inside me shifted. Fear gave way to clarity. She hadn't abandoned me to a fortune. She had built a shield around me, and whatever was coming next, she had already prepared me to survive it. The next morning felt unnaturally still. The sky above my grandmother's mansion was clear, almost indifferent, as if the world had decided to look peaceful on purpose. Inside, though, every nerve in my body was on edge. I stood near the tall windows in the study, watching the long driveway disappear into the trees, my heart beat loud in my ears. Thomas was positioned near the front hall, calm but alert. Daniel and Grace sat at the long table, folders neatly arranged, legal documents stacked with deliberate precision. Everything looked orderly, too orderly for what I knew was coming. Grace checked her watch. If your father intends to act, she said quietly, it will be soon. She didn't have to explain why. Men like my father hated delays. They hated losing momentum. And most of all, they hated being told no. The sound of tires on gravel shattered the silence. Not one car, three. My stomach dropped. I saw them through the window before anyone spoke. My father's black sedan in the lead, Linda's SUV close behind, Evan's sports car trailing like an afterthought, aggressive and impatient. "They're here," I whispered. Thomas nodded once and walked toward the front door. "Stay where you are, Miss Stella." The doorbell rang sharp, insistent. "Not a request." Thomas opened the door before it rang again. My father didn't bother with greetings. "This is getting ridiculous," Robert said as he stepped inside, his eyes already scanning the house as if taking inventory. "You had your moment. Now hand over the keys and the documents." Linda followed him, lips tight, gaze sweeping the marble floors and high ceilings. "Honestly, Stella, you've gone far enough. This house belongs to the Harris family." Evan whistled softly. "Wow, you really moved in fast." I stepped forward, my hands trembling but my voice steady. "This is my home now." My father laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You don't know what you're saying." He walked toward me, stopping just short of my personal space. "This inheritance is beyond you. You're not qualified, you're not prepared, and you're certainly not in charge." Daniel stood. "Mr. Harris, I suggest you lower your voice." My father turned on him. "And I suggest you remember who built this fortune." Grace rose slowly from her chair. "Actually, Margaret Harris did, and she was very clear about who she trusted to carry it forward." My father's jaw tightened. "You people are manipulating her. All of you." "That's enough," I said, surprising myself. Every eye turned to me. "I didn't ask for this fight," I continued. "I didn't ask for the money. But I will not give it to someone who tried to force me into silence." Linda scoffed. "Listen to her. She's playing the victim." At that moment, Grace reached for a remote. "Since you're questioning motives," she said calmly, "perhaps we should let Margaret speak for herself." The screen at the far end of the room lit up. My grandmother appeared, seated in the same chair I had seen the day before. Her expression was composed, her eyes sharp. Robert froze. "Robert," my grandmother said on the recording, her voice steady, "if you are watching this, then you have already tried to take what does not belong to you." The room went silent. She spoke about the years of pressure, the demands disguised as concern, the way love had been replaced by entitlement. "You do not want stewardship," she said. "You want control, and that is why you will never have it." My father's face drained of color. "This is nonsense," he snapped, but the confidence was gone. Before he could say more, the front door opened again. An older man stepped inside, tall, composed, his presence commanding without effort. "Good morning," he said. "Robert." My father stared. "Judge Walker?" The retired judge nodded once. "Margaret asked me to be here if things escalated, and from what I've seen, they have." Evan took a step back. The judge looked directly at my father. "Any further attempts to intimidate or coerce Stella could be considered legal harassment, and given the trust structure, you have no claim to these assets." For the first time, my father had nothing to say. He looked around the room at the documents, the screen, the people standing beside me, and finally understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an end. Without another word, he turned toward the door. Linda followed, her composure shattered. Evan hesitated, then stormed out after them. The door closed behind them, heavy and final. I exhaled, my knees weak. Grace placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did exactly what your grandmother hoped you would." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. Because in that moment, I realized something profound. My father hadn't frozen because he saw power. He froze because he realized he had lost it, and I was no longer afraid of him. For a long moment after they left, no one spoke. The mansion felt different, not quieter, but lighter, as if something heavy had finally been lifted from its walls. I stood in the center of the room, my heart still racing, replaying my father's face in my mind. The shock, the disbelief. The moment he realized this wasn't a battle he could win, I thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, I felt empty. Daniel began gathering the scattered documents, his movements unhurried. Grace shut down the screen and turned to me with a small, reassuring smile. Thomas remained near the door, his posture relaxed for the first time since morning. "They won't stop trying emotionally," Grace said gently. "But legally, this is over." As if on cue, my phone vibrated in my hand. A message from my father. "You didn't have to do this. We're still your family." Another followed almost immediately. "You're letting strangers turn you against your own blood." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Just hours ago, he had tried to take everything from me. Now he wanted to rewrite the story, make himself the wounded one. I didn't reply. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. Some were cold and threatening. Others were suddenly warm, full of nostalgia and selective memory. Linda sent long paragraphs about forgiveness. Evan tried a different approach, hinting at business ideas and mutual benefit. I ignored them all. Instead, I focused on what my grandmother had entrusted to me. Daniel walked me through the legal responsibilities. Grace explained the structure of the trust and the safeguards my grandmother had put in place. I listened, asked questions, took notes. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking from responsibility, I was stepping into it. In the evenings, I walked through the mansion's garden, tracing the paths my grandmother loved. I could almost hear her voice reminding me to stand tall, to breathe, to think clearly before reacting. I realized then that she hadn't just protected me from my family. She had given me permission to choose myself. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows, I made a decision. I called Daniel and Grace into the study and told them what I wanted to do next. "I don't want this fortune to exist just to prove someone else wrong," I said. "I want it to mean something." Grace's eyes softened. "Your grandmother would have liked that." For the first time since her death, I felt something close to peace. The chaos was behind me. What lay ahead wasn't revenge or victory. It was responsibility and the chance to build something my family had never understood. Weeks later, I stood alone in my grandmother's garden, the same place where she used to sit with a cup of tea in the late afternoon, watching the light shift across the roses. The world hadn't slowed down after everything that happened. Meetings continued, papers were signed, decisions waited to be made. But inside me, something had finally settled. For a long time, I believed family was defined by blood and obligation. I thought loyalty meant endurance, staying quiet, staying small, accepting whatever treatment came my way just to belong. Losing my home in one night forced me to confront how fragile that definition really was. What my grandmother gave me wasn't $15 billion. It was perspective. She taught me that wealth doesn't reveal who you are. It amplifies what's already there. In my father, money magnified control and entitlement. In me, it magnified responsibility. And responsibility, I learned, isn't about power over others. It's about protection. About choosing integrity when it would be easier to surrender. With Daniel and Grace's guidance, I began shaping the future of the trust. We allocated funds to education programs, legal aid for people facing financial coercion, and initiatives that gave others the chance to say no without fear of losing everything. Every signature I placed on paper felt intentional, grounded, earned. I visited my grandmother's grave one quiet morning and told her the truth out loud, that I was still afraid sometimes, still unsure. But I was no longer lost. Walking away from my father didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the foundation of any legacy worth protecting. As I locked the mansion doors that evening and looked back at the house glowing warmly behind me, I understood something I wish I'd known sooner. You don't owe your future to people who demand your silence. You owe it to yourself to stand firm, even when it costs you everything familiar. That was the real inheritance. And it was one I intended to honor for the rest of my life.